Welcome to this week's Finance in 5, where we break down the latest in property and finance. Heaps to go through. I'm Jayden, co-host is Simon. Let's jump right in.
Yeah, that's right, Jayden. Today we'll be diving into the data on which suburbs are most likely to be your forever home versus those which are more of a stepping stone. We'll also look at how our lifestyles are changing faster than the homes that we live in. Plus, we've got some updates to the construction sector, population density trends, and where you can actually afford to buy your first home. So let's jump right in. You know, Jayden, we always harp on about how your first home doesn't need to be a forever home. But, you know, there are some places where people do actually find their forever home. Like there are some suburbs people move into and they never leave.
It's amazing. Like I've got friends like that, and even family members, I guess, who they've found the perfect spot and they've been content there for decades. And according to new data, there's actually suburbs where this is completely normal. So Killarney Heights in Sydney, for example, has an average holding period of 20 years.
Yeah, there's a few other suburbs as well. Most of them are in the sort of Sydney and Melbourne area. These are some suburbs that have big houses, swimming pools, outdoor space. You know, they're close to the city, good schools and amenities. I mean, these are you can see why people are holding on to the houses in these suburbs, and that means that they're actually a lot pricier. So these suburbs tend to have pretty high prices, and that's partly because no one wants to sell. Once they buy a house there, they're sticking there.
It's often those sort of golden triangles where, you know, people just stay there. It's hard to get in and out of, and when a place comes up, it's pretty highly sought after.
Yeah, but on the other end of the spectrum, there are these fast turnover suburbs. They're almost like, if you think of Killarney Heights like a middle-aged more like teenagers. These are new areas, they're still developing infrastructure and their community identity, and people tend to kind of buy a house and then quickly flip it within, say, 3 years.
Yeah, these tend to be the ones that invest more investors. So if you look at the suburb sort of mix, there's going to be a high proportion of investors who might have bought a property off the plan, might be looking for a quick sale. They might have bought an investment and grown out of it. It could be a first home buyer that says, well, this is only going to suit me for 1 or 2 years. I can't have a family here. And, you know, some examples of that are sort of Denman Prospect in Canberra, 2.7 years average hold. Yarrabilla in Brisbane, 3.2. Rochedale in Queensland, 3.5. So a lot of these suburbs are sort of getting turned over. People are only holding their property, only keeping the property for around 3 years and then turning it over and moving on, upgrading, selling, and moving to the next place.
Yeah, and what tends to be the key thing here is a lot of these suburbs with the short holding periods, these are where there's a lot of new development. So they're building new housing estates. People are buying off the plan. You know, after a few years, there's a lot of investors who tend to exit. And maybe some people originally bought thinking this new suburb would be the greatest thing for them, and maybe they don't so much like it. But I don't think it's necessarily a problem of desirability. If you're looking at a suburb that has got a short holding period, as a first home buyer actually can be a good thing. You know, you can get a ticket into the market at a lower price point. And remember that these suburbs don't have infrastructure now, but they will build it over time. So if you're buying a house now and there's not, you know, maybe one supermarket and a small school nearby, in 5 or 10 years, you know, these suburbs tend to grow, there tends to be more happening, and they become more valuable. So the suburbs that are the shortest held now could be one of the forever suburbs in the future. All right, so Jayden, I've got a bit of a head scratcher for you. Came across this article. You know, most homes in Australia, they're pretty big, right? Typically the 4-bedroom, backyard, the whole shebang. But the question is this what actually people want these days?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty good question, because like the typical Aussie family has changed a bit. Like more and more people are not wanting to have kids, they're having less kids, they're living alone, they might be living, you know, in a mixed family with different friends, etc. So maybe just our homes haven't kept up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of the houses, or many of the houses we have here are decades old, and they were built for a different time. You know, the average household size in Australia is just 2.5 people now. And compared to 1920, that was 4.6. So in other words, there's fewer people living in each house. And so if you're a couple or even a single person, buying a 4-bedroom home is probably going to be overkill, probably not necessary.
Yeah, it's interesting, like over half the houses listed for sale have 4 bedrooms or more, but 2 or 3 bedrooms are actually more popular in a lot of searches. Depends on work from home as well. Some people want extra office space, but the reality is we could be building things that people don't want these days. It's changing demand.
Yeah, and the units are kind of the opposite. So there's actually a demand for larger units than smaller units. So people are searching for 3-bedroom units versus the 2-bedroom units, even though most developers are still building the 2-bedders. So there is a mismatch here between what stock is available and what people want, especially in suburbs like Sydney, for example, where 3-bedroom units there are highly sought after, but they're just a tiny portion of the available listings. So it's a classic supply and demand issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting takeaway, I guess, for home buyers. You know, obviously a lot of our listeners are sort of in the market searching for homes. It's a fine balance. It's probably a case of looking at your buyer's brief, trying to work out what's going to work for you over the next 1 to 5 years potentially. Maybe you don't need a 4-bedroom if it's just you, your partner, and a dog. Maybe you need an extra bedroom for an office, a home office. Maybe you need some space for kids, but the extra 4 bedrooms, it may not be suitable now, and you could just look at that initial stepping stone, that home that'll suit you guys over the short term.
Absolutely. And I think the key thing here as well is if people are looking for these 2 and 3 bedroom homes, if you buy a small one now and you're worried about selling it in the future because it's not going to be as desirable, I think you can probably put that worry behind you. I think there are downsizers, there are single people, plenty of couples who are deciding not to have children as well. So the demand for these types of properties is probably going to be larger in the future. So I wouldn't be concerned about buying a smaller home now and then looking to upgrade in a later time when your family grows or your situation changes.
All right, so we've been talking a lot about existing homes though, but what about building your own? There's been a lot more demand here with some of the home grants increase in certain states, but is the dream even possible, Simon? With, I guess, all the construction horror stories you turn on the news, there's another builder going broke, there's people losing their home, there's the TikTok building inspector guy that's just freaking people out. So what's it looking like?
Yeah, it's been a pretty wild ride for the construction sector in the past few years. Skyrocketing costs, the delays, like you've said, there's just so many horror stories out there from people who have been trying to build a home. But there's some data from CoreLogic here, which is suggesting that maybe things might be starting to turn a corner. The number of new house approvals hit a 12-year low in January. So there's less approvals for dwellings to be built, which might sound like a bad thing, but it's actually good news because it means there is less work for the builders to do, which means if you are planning on building in the future, you'll actually have a chance to find one in a reasonable amount of time.
And there's still a lot of suppressed demand. So there's even with the fewer approvals, there's a backlog of 255,000 homes approved, but not yet to be built. So the builders have still got work to do, but there's still, they're catching up on that. So hopefully the other thing there is during COVID, we had issues with material prices. Things couldn't get physically to Australia. There were issues with barges and logistics, but now things seem to be calming down. I know from a couple of builders and said sort of timber, concrete, the prices are at least stabilizing. They're a bit more predictable and they're not sort of starting a build today on a fixed price contract and then finding out there's huge cost increases in 6 months' time.
Yeah, I mean, even with this stabilization though, I think one thing to be aware of is building costs are still higher than they were pre-pandemic. So about 27.6% higher than they were. So you can build your dream home if you want to, but it's still going to be pricier than it would have been several years ago. And this isn't really a uniform picture across the country as well. So Queensland and South Australia actually saw slighter increases in construction costs. In New South Wales and Victoria, things eased off a little bit. So it does depend on where you're located as well.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway here is that if you're hoping to build soon, it's still slow. It's still potentially going to be expensive. It's not like it was a few years ago where building a home was kind of like getting a house wholesale. You're saving the 20% that the builder's putting there. You're going to get instant equity. Unfortunately, with some of the price increases and the uncertainty in the industry, it's still not necessarily a cheap way to go. It does have some positives though, with the grant, with some of the concessions that are available depending on the state. But you got to balance that because at the end of the day, it can take 18 months to build a home and you still need to make the interest payments on your loan. Plus you got to rent somewhere and live somewhere. So there's still extra costs there while you're sort of constructing and building a home, plus the risk of the builder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think both you and I typically recommend people to probably look at buying established homes before building in the current market. But if you're really set on building a home and that's your dream, I think a year or two down the line, things are probably going to be in a better situation than they are now. So if you are in that stage where you're planning, it might be a good time to start putting feelers out, looking for builders and getting evaluations on cost, because in a couple of years, it could be an easier proposition than it is now.
So moving on to our next topic, where is the population density highest and what does it mean? So we've obviously seen a huge influx of migration in the last couple of years. Our population's increased. Some of the dwelling construction, as we've covered as well before, it hasn't really kept up. But how have the changing demographics influenced the types of homes people want and how is this impacting where people want to live, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to jump in here is Australia is literally one of the least densely populated countries on Earth. we have such a low population density compared to most cities, most countries. Most of us are all crammed into these capital cities around the edges, but there is still a lot of open space compared to Europe and Asia, many parts of the rest of the world. But that does seem like it's changing to some degree. As our population is growing, it's the fastest rate of growth since the 1950s at the moment. So people are going to be crowded in a little more into smaller spaces. And this is going to change the way that our cities grow and evolve in the future.
Yeah, I think the long-term trend is that there's going to have to be more density because it's quicker to build up and put units there than it is to put railroad tracks and trams and infrastructure for public transport. So the trends are looking like there's going to be sort of more push, especially from local state governments, to put density units there, and the composition of households is changing. So when it comes to some of the actual price of these units and the areas that people are putting them in, those high density areas where you're seeing a whole bunch of supply, a whole bunch of units being built in the short term could see slower growth. There's new developments, it creates oversupply and could put downwards pressure, which could be actually good for home buyers. It means it's going to be opportunity to buy at a potentially cheaper price.
Yeah, what I think is interesting is when you think of, let's say, density and migration, there's more people living in one area. You think, well, surely there's more demand. Prices are going to have to go up in those zones. But then you see this balancing effect of developers see all the increased density, and so they'll build new supply in those areas. You remember Fortitude Valley in Brisbane over the past 10 years. I lived in Fortitude Valley in 2014, and there was a massive oversupply of units because of the increased density. Everyone came in, like, let's build about 20 different apartment buildings or more. There was cranes all over the sky. So that meant that house prices, or the apartment prices, really were much slower than you might expect. And the same was true for rent. There was a really slow rise in rent for several years due to that fact. So compared to units where increased density can make some slight upward pressure on rent, houses just do completely unfazed. So a house in a higher density area, the amount of population density doesn't have an effect on prices or on rent. So you might think buying a house in a place that's full of apartments will mean it's going to be much more valuable because someone will buy it later on and turn it into a block of units, but the data doesn't seem to show that that's the case. The takeaways here are, for a home buyer, is looking at population growth and density is not really necessarily all that useful if you're looking to buy a home to live in. You could probably safely ignore it. If you're buying as an investor, you might also want to think that buying in places with less density will potentially give you a better return.
All right, Simon, let's switch gears and talk about affordability. We know it's a huge concern for everyone at the moment, but I guess there are some bright spots in this tricky market.
Yeah, it's literally the $1 million question. Where can I buy an affordable home? And luckily there is some fresh data here from PropTrack's affordability hotspot report, which kind of sheds some light on some of the best areas where you can buy. Right off the bat, WA and Queensland, in terms of cities, in terms of states rather, these are the most affordable states. Western Australia, in 41% of regions across the state, you can afford a home if you're on a median income. That's a pretty significant chunk. And Queensland is up in the 20% as well.
Sydney, on the other hand, it's kind of always been, for as long as I've remembered, really, like only 3.8% of homes are within reach for medium income earners. And to get that, you got to look sort of Parramatta and Southwest. So if you're looking there, as we covered a couple of weeks ago, actually, there are still homes for, under $900,000, which is affordable in Sydney, but it is possible. In Melbourne, it's a bit trickier. The inner city is surprisingly the most affordable part of the city. It's the inverse to Sydney, where Sydney got to get further out of town. Melbourne, because there's a bit of an abundance of units, that's where it's going to be more affordable. And if you're looking for a house, west suburbs of Melbourne is definitely where you can get the best bang for your buck.
Yeah, and if you're looking to buy in Brisbane, as it has been for quite a while, the southern and western regions of Brisbane are really the shining stars for affordability. So the Logan, Bow Desert area, I think we've covered these as well before, and Ipswich as well. These are great areas to buy in. A large amount of these properties are still affordable. They are actually seeing pretty strong price growth at the moment because they are so affordable. Everyone's catching on to the potential here, and they're looking at shifting to these newer areas that are growing rapidly while still remaining affordable.
Yeah, so if you're still getting price at your dream suburb, if you've been looking for a while, which is the case for a lot of people, consider completely turning everything on its head. Sometimes the next suburb over, it might not be possible. It might be worth considering a whole different region. And interestingly, in some cities like Melbourne, it could be more affordable to get a house in the outer suburbs than a unit in the inner city suburbs, but you've got to balance that sort of lifestyle piece and your future goals as well.
Yeah, and I think another thing to mention here is if you are looking to buy your first home, which isn't your forever home, then these affordable hotspots tend to see significant price growth as well. The drive for affordability increases demand, which increases price over a longer term. So you could buy your first home in one of these regions, and in a few years' time, you're likely to see some growth in your equity, and then you can look at shifting to where you want to buy your forever home. So yeah, that's a wrap on today's Finance in 5. I think we've covered a lot of ground, from the forever homes to the changing needs of Aussie households, the ups and downs of the construction sector, and even the impact of population density on property prices. We had a look at the affordability crisis and showed you some hotspots where first home buyers still have a chance to make their mark. And I think, remember, the market is always changing. So, that's why we do this every week. We talk about the latest developments. And my recommendation is stay informed, do your research, and don't be afraid to think outside of the box. With a bit of knowledge and a whole lot of determination, that dream home might be closer than you think.
Yeah, I think definitely. So if you're feeling a bit lost, need a bit of guidance on your first home buying journey, hit us up at Hunts Galloway. We're the home for home buyers across Australia. We can give you a free home loan assessment or just a bit of guidance on the next steps in your home buying process. So visit us at huntsgalloway.com.au. And until the next time, we'll see you guys.